Oh boy, this is gonna be hard to make because Nintendo consoles are like children to me. I felt the most fair way to rank these was to base them off the hardware itself and any additional features that may have enhanced them. And we're only counting consoles, not arcade cabinets or handhelds. So with that out of the way, let's get her ranked. 18. Wii Mini. This is the only Nintendo console that I can't see anybody wanting to own unless they're collectors or something. The Wii Mini is really interesting because it wasn't available in big countries like Japan and Australia, and you've probably noticed that this thing looks physically different too. You put your Wii discs in by opening up a tray and pushing it into place like with the GameCube. And speaking of, there's no slots for a GameCube controller or memory card, so that means no backwards compatibility. And the online was stripped entirely, so you can't download games or play anything online, even when the service was available. There's also only one USB port in the back instead of two, and no way to insert an SD card. So what on earth does this thing have? Well, the box comes with a red Wii Motion Plus controller, a red nunchuck, which I didn't get when I ordered this, and Mario Kart Wii. Even at the cheap price point, so many features were removed that I don't understand why anybody would ever use this when you can get a Wii for the exact same price. Even when it first launched, the Wii really didn't cost that much more. 17. iQ Player. So this is a Chinese exclusive console slash plug and play that I don't happen to own.
Hey guys, Nintendo here. Seems like you're in a bit of a pickle.
Well, the iQ Player was too expensive for me to get, but it was developed and released through a joint venture in China, so it should count for the list.
Yeah, and this was during a time when physical video games were banned in the country, so the fact that Nintendo found a way around that is pretty extraordinary. The console itself is really just this controller. It looks a lot like an original Xbox controller, and all the games are stored on a 64 megabyte flash card. You could buy games like Mario Kart 64, Animal Crossing, and about 20 other hit titles. Plus it came with demos of games like Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64, and Star Fox 64. While this is pretty interesting and all, the iQ Player is extremely limited because the card could only hold up to 5 games at a time. And yeah, there are demos you can play, but each of them are limited to 1 hour, and once your time is up, they're gone for good. Playing multiplayer is also way more difficult today because you'd have to find a special multiplayer box to make it happen, and accessories like the Rumble Pack aren't compatible at all. It's a neat piece of history, but not really worth seriously playing today unless you're a more hardcore collector.
16. Famicom Classic. You may be a bit shocked to see a newer console so high on this list, but I have my reasonings. One of the gimmicks of the original Famicom was having their controllers tied directly to the console and fitting them on the sides. This kind of made sense back in the 80s because TVs were a lot smaller and having the whole console next to you made a bit more sense. But this mini console came out in 2016. Those tiny TVs don't really exist anymore. I like the console, but it just isn't that practical. Being forced to have the console so close to you is pretty clunky and just not a great experience. They could have made the controllers wireless but still fit in the slots on the sides, but they chose to not change anything, outside of the HD graphics and being able to save state. It also didn't come with an AC adapter, but thankfully the hookup is just a USB, so you'll probably find one laying around so you can power this up and play. 15. Famicom. And here is the OG console. Now sure, it can't play games in a high resolution, but at least it makes a lot more sense to have the controllers attached to the console. And when I say it makes more sense, that doesn't mean the idea was necessarily a good thing. Having detachable controllers is simply more convenient, but the console itself is pretty neat. For one, inserting games in and out is pretty simple compared to the American NES, which we'll get to later. You could also add a device called the Family Computer Disk System, which allowed you to play games on floppy disks. While it was never brought to the States, the way these disks worked was really cool. You could buy them normally or go to a kiosk and essentially pick out and swap your existing games with new ones. You can even power this thing with batteries if you don't want to use an AC adapter. But even with the add-on, the attached controllers is still a bit of a letdown. 14. NES. So this is the Famicom, but it was built to look like a VCR. In the 80s, it made a lot of sense to mold the console like this, so it appealed to the Western audience more. But nowadays, it looks kinda bulky. Inserting games requires you to open this door, push them in, and then down to lock into place. This is fine and all, but the mechanism hasn't aged well, seeing as my NES games easily get stuck inside, and this is after getting my console cleaned out. The big plus is, of course, that the NES controllers have longer wires and you can detach them. Plus, I find them to be a bit more of a higher quality. But this is about consoles. I already ranked the Nintendo controllers, so let's stay on track. 13. NES Top Loader / AV Famicom. This is an almost perfect upgrade to the original NES. The best thing is the games easily come in and out of the system. No more crappy doors and hinges. There's also no region locking, so you can play games from anywhere in the world. The top loader came with these dogbone controllers too, which most people tend to prefer over the originals simply because they're more comfortable to hold. My only issue with this upgraded console is they got rid of the composite ports. You can only use RSF, which is more finicky to hook up and just makes the picture look worse. And it's a bit weird that there's no LED light to indicate if your system is on or not. But overall, the improvements make the top loader slightly better than the original. I'll quickly mention that Japan also got an upgrade to the Famicom called the AV or New Famicom, which looks identical to the top loader. The only difference is the RF ports were replaced with AV ports, hence the name. 12. Nintendo 64. I'm trying to not come off as biased with this console. You may have noticed by my channel avatar that I'm a fan of the N64, and it certainly does a lot right. One of the coolest features is having 4 dedicated controller ports. While you could technically add 4 ports with older systems using something like the NES 4-score, having them right on the console really encouraged developers to create local multiplayer games. And the N64 is the king of that, with games like Smash Bros, GoldenEye, Mario Kart 64, Pokemon Stadium, and the list goes on and on. You could also add this thing called an expansion pack, which basically added more RAM to your console so you could play games like Donkey Kong 64, Perfect Dark, or Majora's Mask. In Japan, there was also an N64 disk drive, but I don't have one to show because, well, these prices speak for themselves. The only thing I can say I really don't like about the console is the controllers aren't that great despite how innovative they were, and using carts probably wasn't the best idea. First off, where's the end labels? I have to create my own just so I can keep track of all my N64 games. And second, competition like the PlayStation and later the Xbox were using discs, which allowed them to store more data, but Nintendo chose to stick with cartridges, which really hurt them in the long run, since a lot of third-party developers couldn't fit their games on there. 11. New Style SNES / Super Famicom Jr. I really debated on including this because it's so similar to the original SNES, but there are a couple changes. The most notable is of course the new, sleek look on the American and Japanese versions. The Super Famicom Jr.'s biggest difference is that it was no longer compatible with the Satellaview due to the way the console was built, which is a device we'll get to in a minute. Like the NES top loader, the LED indicator light was removed, so you can't tell if the console is on or not. Honestly, this new SNES could be interchanged with 10. SNES. The title of this console really proved itself the word super. The graphics were now 16-bit. The controllers were much more comfortable. There's more buttons. You could easily eject your cartridge. What more could you ask for? Well, how about the Super Game Boy? Popping this into your SNES lets you play your favorite Game Boy games on the big screen and even adds color to some of them. Nowadays, that might not seem that impressive, but in the 90s when this launched, it was mind-blowing being able to play Game Boy games without having to worry about your batteries dying. And plus, there's an LED light which makes it slightly better than the remodel, at least for me. 9. Super Famicom. So I won't reiterate what this console has to offer as it's basically the same thing as the original SNES. The main difference is its compatibility with the Satellaview. This peripheral was a satellite modem which allowed you to download games and even magazines. The idea that this even existed before the mainstream internet was around is kind of insane, and it lasted for several years. This peripheral alone gives it an edge over the American version of the SNES. 8. GameCube. Here's another console that is still just such a bizarre piece of tech. Instead of something that's more rectangular and flattened, this is literally a cube with a handle on the back. The handle is always made fun of, but if you really think about it, it does make a lot of sense for it to be there. It's easy to carry around, say, an N64 with one hand because you can get a better grip on its sides, but with the GameCube, that wouldn't have been the case if the handle wasn't there. There's 4 controller ports once again, as well as 2 slots for memory memory cards. The discs are super tiny, which Nintendo did to avoid piracy, but this once again kinda screwed them over with third-party developers since they couldn't hold as much data as a PS2 or Xbox disc. But even with all of that, this console has some incredible and unique games, and the controller is so good that it's still being produced to this day for Smash Bros. Ultimate. There's a fantastic peripheral you can add to it called the Game Boy Player, which is similar to the SNES add-on, but now you can play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. And I mean, come on, you can't beat that GameCube intro. 7. NES Classic. So now we're pretty much left with the more modern consoles, and the NES Classic is a pretty solid one. The graphics are now in HD, you can save state your games, and the 30 included are pretty awesome picks. My only real issue here is the controllers are way too short, but at least you can get controller extenders. Plus, you can use different controllers like a Wii Classic Pro since the port is exactly the same. That means you can use an NES controller on your Wii to play Wii Virtual Console games, but that's besides the point. That's just cool. I should also mention that modding this console is extremely easy compared to any other console, which is why I think it's worth bringing up as an advantage. If you wanted to mod your console, you can add more NES games to your library with all the perks this mini system already offers. 6. SNES Classic. This is obviously the same idea as the NES Classic, but the games are all SNES. While there aren't as many to play, only 20 compared to the 30, the selection is pretty darn great on top of the first official release of Star Fox 2. How crazy is that? Nintendo releasing a SNES game to the public 20 years after the console came out. The package also comes with 2 SNES controllers, while the NES one only came with the 1 controller. The cords are still a little short, but they're definitely longer, so I can at least accept the length of them. And to bring up modding games once again, if you wanted to do that, now you can add SNES games on top of the extra NES ones or even Game Boy like I did. 5. Super Famicom Classic. I really don't have much to add here since this is just the SNES Classic, but Japanese in a slightly different selection of games. The two could be interchanged. I chose to put this one above the American version simply because it's a touch smaller, making it a little bit easier to store. 4. Wii RVL 101. You're probably wondering, what the heck is that? Well, it's a Wii, but without any GameCube support. That's right. As Nintendo was transitioning into selling the Wii U, they sold these different versions that don't have the ports, but everything else is still intact. I thought I might as well bring this console up since it is technically different hardware-wise. 3. Wii. It seems strange to have this up so high since it's so radically different to Nintendo's other consoles, but it really did so much that people may look over. One of my favorite additions is the backwards compatibility with all GameCube games, and it was easily tucked onto the top of the console. The controllers aren't exactly my favorite, but there was a lot of official Nintendo ones to pick from, like the Wii Remote, Nunchuck, Wii Classic, and Wii Pro. Everything being wireless was really nice. It was just straight up more convenient and created less clutter. Plus, the Wii had the Wii Shop channel, which allowed you to download hundreds of retro games as well as WiiWare titles and other channels. Now, sure, the Wii library is filled with shovelware, and the Wiimote is kinda gimmicky, but you can't deny the power of the Wii. Although I do wish it was in HD. Using composite cables even back then was a tiny bit lame. 2. Wii U. So yeah, this is Nintendo's worst home selling console due to the fact that they had no idea how to market this thing and it was called Wii U. But the console itself is really awesome, and like the Wii, I think people forget that. It was Nintendo's first step into HD. It was backwards compatible with all Wii games, plus the entire Wii Shop channel catalog. The gamepad was a pretty neat controller despite a few of its shortcomings. You can even use all of your old Wii stuff, which means the Wii U was compatible with like 6,000 controllers. It's kind of ridiculous. Now, it wasn't nearly as powerful as the PS3 or Xbox 360, but it definitely does a lot more than the original Wii did. In terms of the console itself, I do wish it had a bit more internal storage, because 32 gigabytes for the deluxe version is pretty low. It's too bad that the console flopped because it was and still is pretty sick. And number 1 is the Switch. I'm sure nobody is surprised this is number 1, and it's kind of strange that it is because it's Nintendo's first hybrid console. Even though it's technically a handheld, it uses the dock and can be played on the big screen, so I think we'll let it slide on this list. What more do I need to say about the Switch? It's one of Nintendo's greatest ideas for a console ever. The Joy-Cons are technical marvels despite being a bit small. They easily slide into the Switch so you can change them while playing in handheld mode at the same time. The dock itself could use some upgrading, but the ability to switch from handheld to dock is incredibly seamless. And hey, even though the Wii U flopped and people didn't really play all the awesome Wii U games, almost all the best ones have been ported to the Switch, or similar sequels exist now like Splatoon 2 or Super Mario Maker 2. And if you don't want to use the Joy-Cons, you have the Switch Pro controller, which I won't go into, but you already know it's one of the best in the industry. Now the Switch is still a new console, so we don't have all the same backwards compatibility like with the Wii and Wii U, but as time goes on, I'm sure they'll add more retro games and they'll continue to grow their library. There are so many interesting Nintendo controllers out there, so I thought it would be great to make a video ranking every single one. And I mean all of them. Any variants that were developed by Nintendo are on this list. Now real quick, I wanted to throw out 3 honorable mentions that I couldn't get because they were way too expensive to buy. And that includes the N64 IQ player controller, the N64 mouse, and the NES HFC. So with that, let's get her ranked. 26, SNES Super Scope. Now yes, this is technically an accessory, but I'm counting the Super Scope as a controller because you do control games with it. And it's honestly the only Nintendo controller I don't like. I mean, sure, the design overall is pretty cool, I can't deny that, and this thing is a freaking honker. It's so big that it requires 6 AA batteries just to work. But that's not the issue. My real frustration is with the accuracy. I feel like my shots only work when they feel like working, which is kind of a problem for something that's supposed to be precise. Maybe my TV is the issue, I don't know. But that doesn't explain why the shooting button is on the top of the gun. Why? They even carved out a spot for the trigger but put the button on the top? I just don't understand that at all. 25, We Speak. So here's the thing with this mic. It's actually pretty decent in quality and works well with Animal Crossing Wild World. Or should I say, did work well. Now that the internet connection no longer works on the Wii, this mic is nothing more than a dead weight. I've never in my life had a controller that's functionally fine no longer able to work because of the internet. That alone makes this one of the most useless controllers of all time since it can't be utilized offline. 24, NES Power Pad. You know, I do love that name, the Power Pad. It's so 80s. I mean, just look at how colorful and taggy this thing is. And I mean that in a good way, I promise. While this is a decent pad, only a couple games work with it. And since you're playing NES games, it doesn't feel any more immersive than just using a controller. 23, N64 Microphone. Obviously, We Speak has a better microphone than this one, but at least this still works. And when I say works, I mean that sounds are picked up, but it doesn't articulate actual words. Yes, we're talking about Hey You Pikachu, one of the worst Pokemon games of all time. It seems like this mic does a bad job deciphering language. All that happens is Pikachu yells at me because he thinks I said something I didn't say. And maybe it's just the game, but even if it is, look at this mic and just how cheap and just crappy it is. 22, GameCube Microphone. This is pretty similar to the N64 mic, but it has much better accuracy with words. I used this a lot with the Mario Party games and rarely had issues with it. It was compatible with a few more games than the N64 mic was, but it's still pretty underutilized throughout the GameCube's library. 21, NES Zapper. With all the shooting items in Smash Bros, I'm surprised that this hasn't been added like the Super Scope was back in Melee. The Zapper feels pretty great. The trigger even has a nice little spring sound. While it does work with some games like Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley, you basically have to have a TV from the 80s for it to work. But despite that, they still tend to work pretty well, even for being such an old controller. 20, SNES Mouse. Here's another controller that was only supposed to be for one game, Mario Paint. It ended up being so good that dozens of SNES games added support for this mouse. The buttons don't click exactly like a real mouse does, but they still feel pretty solid. Moving around is also surprisingly responsive and accurate, albeit the movement speed on my end was a touch slow. Mario Paint wouldn't have worked with a normal controller, so its inclusion added all of its worth and value. 19. GameCube DK Bongos. So real quick, I know Namco developed Donkey Konga and Nintendo only published the game, but there's been some debate that Nintendo themselves created the bongos. I couldn't really find out if they did or not, but I'm adding them to the list anyway because these things are just so neat. You got 2 big bongos to slap, 1 button on the side, and a mic that can pick up clapping. Slapping the bongos just feels so nice. They've got a really good bounce to them. They are really loud, however, so this is a game you probably can't play with people in the same room. But I mean, come on, you can't go wrong with bongo controllers. 18. Wii Balance Board. I remember when this was the biggest craze back in the Wii days, and even now the balance board is still rather impressive. It's easy to hook up, has a good battery life, it can measure your weight and sense where the weight is coming from. It made for a lot of really fun and interesting minigames. I never actually lost weight with the balance board, but I love that it was used in a few games beyond Wii Fit, like Super Monkey Ball Step and Roll, and even Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Winter Games. 17. Switch Pokeball Plus. I'm honestly still baffled this exists. It's really too bad it has such an awkward feel to it. There's only 2 buttons, one at the top and the little analog stick in the middle which can be pushed down. I tried playing some of Pokemon Let's Go with this controller, and well, it's just not very comfortable. The biggest problem is my hand cramps up when playing for too long, and the gyrometer seems to only work sometimes, but maybe I'm just using it wrong or something. I do love how it plays Pokemon Center music when you charge it though. And of course, the Pokemon cries from inside the ball are so charming. It's neat that you can play the entire game with it. I just wish it had an extra button, or maybe it was a little bit bigger. 16. Virtual Boy Controller. Where do I even begin with this? Well, I guess I'll admit that the ergonomics are good. It does mesh with your hands pretty well, but why are there 2 D-pads? An analog stick on one side would have made a lot more sense. I'm also not a fan of where start and select are placed. These kinds of buttons should be more discreet because they aren't meant to be easy to push. That's why they're usually small and out of the way on every other controller. But I guess it kind of makes sense for this since the Virtual Boy, you can't see where you're looking with the headset on. And also, what's with the shoulder buttons? These are like the lamest shoulder buttons I've ever seen. They don't feel distinct at all. I mean, this controller is functional, I guess, but it just feels like a step back. 15. N64 Controller. There's a lot of great and horrible things going on here. Firstly, this controller is really innovative with it being the first ever trigger button on the back, an analog stick for home consoles, and the rumble/controller packs you can attach. Unfortunately, the stick is horrible. I have a few controllers and none of them work very well anymore. And to address the elephant in the room, yeah, this controller's design is stupid. This 3-pronged shape just doesn't make any sense, but I find it to be pretty comfortable, and most games choose between using the D-pad or analog, so it works out. Want to play Pokemon Puzzle League? You use the D-pad side. Want to play Mario 64? Use the analog side. 14. NES backs. I can see some people disagreeing with me having this so low on the list, but let me explain. I do think this controller has a nice grip to it, and the addition of the turbo buttons is appreciated too, but something about all the buttons just feels off. A and B in the turbo buttons look like the traditional 4-button layout, but kind of turned to its side, and it comes off as awkward to use. And what is with this circle pad? The D-pad itself works fine, but there's zero reason for this little knob to exist for games that only move in 4 or 8 directions to begin with. 13. Wii Remote/Nunchuck. These things get a bad rap nowadays, but I don't think they're complete cancer. The motion controls in some of the games work really well, assuming you're using Motion Plus, of course. The buttons have a nice feel to them. There's an attachable nunchuck with a prominent analog stick, there's a speaker that plays game sounds sometimes, and I love that you can power the console on and off right from the remote. But sadly, there are a lot of games that forced in motion controls, which in turn kind of ruin the games that could have been great. And trying to play games with the remote held sideways really sucks. There just isn't much to grip to, and both sides are inconsistent, which makes for a clumsy experience. 12. SNES Scoremaster. Here's a controller that's clearly made for something like Street Fighter 2. I didn't even know it existed until I did research for this video. There's so much on this panel. You got the joystick, the 6 main buttons, and turbo switches for each individual button, all with different speeds. That's a lot of customization for a controller. The buttons are a great size too and have a good click to them. However, my A button didn't respond very well, but that could just be from age because all the other buttons were perfect. The joystick also feels a tad bit stiff, but it worked a lot better than I expected it to. You can easily set this on a table or even your lap and have a great time with this. 11. NES Advantage. Like the Scoremaster, this controller has a wide variety of buttons you can use. Of course, there's the joystick, the other main buttons, a slow button which only works for some games, and 2 turbo buttons that has a dial to control the speed of the turbo. While there's less features on the Advantage compared to the Scoremaster, I found this controller works a lot better. It's just a bit more compact, as well as the buttons and joystick being more responsive. I honestly didn't think the joystick was going to be this fluid, but it works perfectly with any game you're playing on top of fighting games. 10. NES Controller. What else needs to be said about this iconic controller? The design is absolutely classic. The buttons and D-pad feel great despite being a tad mushy. Some people have complained about the sharp edges, but I've personally never been bothered with them. I suppose it depends on the size of your hands. I'll mention the Famicom controllers too because they function pretty much the same, outside of the second controller having a mic for some reason. 9. Wii U Gamepad. Yes, obviously there's a lot of flaws. The touchscreen is only one touch, the battery life is horrible, and it doesn't hold a charge for very long. There's a camera for really no good reason, and the TV button was hardly used at all. But even with all of that, I still kinda love this thing. Despite the size, the gamepad molds with your hands really nicely, and it has a great weight. All the buttons feel fantastic. The quality is supreme in that department. And the gyro controls are perfected. Say hi to a little game called Splatoon. So as clumsy as this controller looks, I'm glad it exists and still enjoy using it whenever I need to pop in a Wii U game. 8. NES Controller 2 or the Dogbone. This is one of the best redesigns I've ever seen a controller get. The spoon-shaped sides feel amazing on your hands. The buttons are much crisper and more responsive than the original, and while the A and B buttons are placed a bit weird, they still work out pretty fine. If anyone is getting into retro gaming, spend the extra money to get a dog mode controller. It's absolutely worth it. 7. Switch Joy-Cons. These are some of the most advanced controllers ever conceived. You got the HD rumble, the buttons on the sides, the NFC reader, the capture button, the tiny IR camera. It's insane how much technology is crammed into these. The only real issue is they're just too small. I can cup an entire Joy-Con in my hand, and that's not really a good thing. And the ZL/ZR buttons are atrocious unless you add that Joy-Con grip, but nobody wants to deal with those considering how difficult they are to take off. 6. Wii Classic Controller. The buttons and joystick have a really clean feel to them. In fact, this is one of the best D-pads I've ever used. There is of course some weird things going on, like these awkwardly placed ZL and ZR buttons. I'm not sure why they're on the sides like that, but because the controller is shaped like an oval, they're surprisingly easy and natural to reach. And why doesn't anyone bring up that this controller has analog triggers? I adore that Nintendo included this since they often don't with their controllers. There is of course some strange quirks, like the cord being on the bottom, plus there's this button in the middle that opens and closes these slots. I'm guessing it was supposed to be for an accessory, but I don't think it was ever actually utilized for anything. 5. Wii Classic Pro. This is basically the Wii Classic controller, but slightly better. While sadly it removed the analog triggers, it does position the ZL and ZR buttons in better spots, so I guess it's a fair trade-off. The shape is also more natural. I've got a bit of a better grip to hold on with. And they even fixed that cord issue and stuck the end back on the top like it's supposed to be. 4. SNES Controller. This controller is legendary and speaks volumes for the game industry as a whole. It's standardized how most controllers look today with the 4-button layout, and with the shoulder buttons too. It's not even just that, but everything about this controller was thoroughly thought out and well constructed. As an example, let's analyze the face buttons. The Y and X buttons have outer lips which give the tip of your thumb more grip. The B and A buttons are smoother on purpose so that you can easily push down Y and B at the same time, or X and A at the same time. Most controllers don't go to this extent of detail, but it really pays off. The only thing I don't like are the start and select buttons, as they feel too mushy, but otherwise this thing kicks ass. 3. Wii U Pro Controller. This has to be one of the most overlooked controllers of all time because everyone just talked about the gamepad. This is incredibly comfortable to hold. Every button feels amazing and they're all sized just right. And the battery life, get this, can go for 80 hours. Yeah, 80 hours is ridiculous on one charge. The only thing this needed was some analog triggers, but otherwise it's a gem. 2. GameCube controller / Wavebird. This controller is so good that Nintendo hasn't gotten rid of it for all the new Smash Bros. Games. Now at first glance, you might look at this thing and go, huh? Why are all the buttons so different and funky looking? The different sizes all signify varying levels of importance. The A button is nice and big, showing it's going to be the main button you use, with B being a bit lower as the second main button. Y and X wrap around A for convenience sake and is used for things like jumping or swapping stuff around. And the joystick has to be one of the best I've ever used, and even has little notches to help you move perfectly straight if need be. And those shoulder buttons, ooh, they're just orgasmic. It's the best shoulder buttons Nintendo has ever created. Really, the only flaws with this controller is the D-pad being a little small, and it seems strange to only have one Z button when they could have added two. And real quick, the Wavebird is basically the same thing, but wireless. Now, it's not just a wireless controller, it's one of the first to use radio signals, which is significantly better than most wireless controllers back in the day that forced you to face the console for them to work. And number 1 is the Switch Pro controller. This may not be a perfect controller, but it's about as close to perfection as you can get. Every button in the joysticks are nice and meaty, and the shoulder buttons feel fantastic. The grips are just mesmerizing. You can hold this thing for hours on end with zero discomfort. The battery life is phenomenal on this as well and uses USB-C to charge. The gyro controllers and HD rumble really make this stand out compared to the PS4 and Xbox One controllers, plus they even fit the NFC reader and capture button inside. The only thing that could have been improved was the shoulder buttons being analog, but otherwise it lives up to its name. It truly is a pro controller. And that's gonna wrap things up. That is until Nintendo makes some more controllers, but that—
Hold on just a hot second.
Huh?
You're forgetting about the NJS 3D1.
And what is that exactly?
This guy, the Nintendo 3D1 joystick for PC. This is a fully featured flight stick licensed by Nintendo exclusively for use with home computers. In fact, this is the only official Nintendo controller which doesn't work with any Nintendo home console. Plus, it's got a pretty weird backstory with some questionable licensing issues.
I see. Nintendo has certainly had a handful of handhelds, so we're gonna go ahead and rank them all. This is based off how practical the handhelds are hardware-wise, and if they were good products during their height of release. I won't be including Game & Watch because they don't have cartridges unlike all these other systems. So with that said, let's get her ranked. 20. Virtual Boy. Is anybody really surprised the Virtual Boy is Nintendo's worst handheld? It's hard to even classify it as a handheld because of how awkward it is to use. It's a big headset that you put on a stand that doesn't even have a head strap. That's the equivalent of glasses without end pieces. This design choice makes zero sense, and to top it off, the graphics are absolutely horrible. The Virtual Boy is infamous for its games being in red and black, and also giving everybody massive headaches. All I can really say is that the Virtual Boy came out way before the technology was ready. About 15 to 20 years later, we have the 3DS, which actually has 3D in their games, and of course there's Labo VR and countless other headsets. 19. Pokemon Mini. Here we have a little device that came out around the time Pokemon was blowing up and when Tamagotchis were a big trend. It's the smallest handheld Nintendo has ever created and only has a D-pad with 2 buttons. You'd probably expect this would come packaged with games, but there's actually cartridges that you insert into the back. But the library is smaller than the Virtual Boy's and it's nothing but Pokemon titles. But at least it won't give you an eye strain, right? The games are nothing too special. It's basically just short mini games featuring your favorite Pokemon. What's cool to note is that it runs on just one AAA battery, and some of these games are emulated for the GameCube game Pokemon Channel. There's really nothing worthwhile about the Pokemon Mini, but it's definitely a neat and charming piece of history. 18. Game Boy. I know this is a treasured handheld and considered an absolute classic, and it definitely earns that merit. It was a huge step forward from the Game & Watch for the simple fact that its games came on cartridges, and let's not forget that it debuted with Tetris, one of the biggest puzzle games to this day. While it ran on 4 AA batteries, they lasted for quite a while considering the colors are only greenish and black. The Game Gear and Atari Lynx had better graphics, but the batteries drained a lot faster and ended up being more of a downgrade to the Game Boy. Its button selection replicates that of an NES controller, and they still have a nice grip and are really easy to use. However, the screen is a bit on the small side and there's no backlight, so you can only see the games if you're under a bunch of light. 17. Game Boy Pocket. There's not too much to add that hasn't already been said since it's extremely similar to the original. The main difference being that it's a bit smaller, a bit lighter, and uses one less battery. The screen is a little bit bigger and removes the greenish display and replaces it with entirely black and white colors. Strangely, the first model of the Game Boy Pocket didn't have an LED showing battery life, but was added to future models after people complained about its absence. Nintendo's done this same thing to its revisions of the NES and SNES too. I'm not sure why this was such a trend for them. 16. Game Boy Light. As the name implies, it's the Game Boy, but now with a backlit screen. For some reason, this only came out in Japan, but the fact that you can more easily see your screen makes this the best version of OG Game Boys. It also retains the sleek design from the Game Boy Pocket, but it's a touch bigger. 15. Game Boy Color. This was actually my first Nintendo system. I remember getting this when I was about 6, and the games I got with it were Super Mario Bros. Deluxe and Pokemon Blue. That Christmas, I also got the Worm Light, because for some reason, Nintendo went back to having no backlight on their screens, so I needed this for playing at night when I wasn't supposed to. Dropping the backlight is just baffling, but I find it's better than the Game Boy Light regardless because it is backwards compatible with all Game Boy games. The screen is also a bit bigger, and the games are obviously now in color and looking a lot better. There's no new buttons or anything, but the outer shells are pretty interesting as you can get Game Boy colors in a lot of different colors. And you can't forget about the Game Boy camera and printer. Taking pictures with a device like this was mind-boggling at the time. 14. Game Boy Micro. I always ask myself why the Micro has any reason to exist, but I'm so glad that it does. Nintendo for some reason decided to make a Game Boy Advance as tiny as humanly possible, and then sell it after the DS came out. Tell me how that makes any sense at all. But look at this little guy. Who could resist a Game Boy Micro? Nintendo even made the A and B buttons lowercase to emphasize its puniness. The main reason I've put this as the worst Game Boy Advance variant is it removes the Game Boy's strongest feature, backwards compatibility. That's right, you can't play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games on this. And let's be honest, it's just too small to play anything comfortably for long periods of time. 13. Game Boy Advance. It was a close call putting this handheld above or below the Micro because this system doesn't have a backlit screen, but it can play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, so that makes it slightly better for that reason. And it's a bit more comfortable to hold too. Plus, this was the first Game Boy to include the R and L shoulder buttons. The graphics were a lot crisper and the games were running even better, despite the cartridge shrinking in size. You could also use this thing called an e-reader, which let you scan in cards to either play games or add content to other GBA games. There was also a wireless adapter used for tracking Pokemon more seamlessly. And you can't forget about the Game Boy Advance video where you can watch the entirety of Shrek 1 or Shrek 2 on the go. Call me biased, but it doesn't get better than that. 12. Game Boy Advance SP. For a time, this was the perfect gaming system. It fixed nearly every flaw the original Game Boy Advance had. The biggest was reviving the backlight and keeping it for all future handhelds. The console was also more compact and folded, which helped keep the screen from getting damaged. Even with the smaller size, you could still play all your Game Boy Color, and of course Game Boy Advance titles. There was even an updated model that has an even brighter looking screen. And better yet, the system was rechargeable, so you no longer needed to swap out batteries. My only gripe with the SP is that it got rid of the headphone jack. This is before Apple was famous for removing that from their iPhones, but thankfully there is an adapter so you can easily fix that problem. 11. Nintendo DS. With a slogan like "touching is good," you know we have ourselves a winner. The DS looks like a Game Boy Advance SP but on steroids. It has 2 screens and 2 additional buttons, and the bottom screen can be touched with a stylus which snugly fits into the back. There's even a microphone on this handheld, and it has Wi-Fi connectivity so you can play games online or send your friends messages with PictoChat. And on top of that, it's even backwards compatible with Game Boy Advance titles, but nothing below that, sadly. It's truly a hallmark of a handheld to include this many new features, and I haven't even brought up the games yet. You can now play fully fledged 3D games like Super Mario 64 DS, Mario Kart DS, Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks, Animal Crossing Wild World, and the list just went on and on and on. 10. Nintendo DS Lite. So here we have another DS, but it's quite a bit sleeker looking and not so bulky like the original. It's also a bit lighter, has a brighter screen, the stylus is a bit meatier, and it even came with a blank GBA slot to prevent dust when you didn't have a GBA game inside. So it's really not too different, it just looks a lot prettier. 9. Nintendo DSi. And here's the next iteration of the DS family. Gone is the GBA slot at the bottom, but now we have an even bigger screen as well as 2 digital cameras and an SD card slot. The system also had an eShop for DSi games, and it was slightly more powerful than a DS Lite. I think it's good to note that the cameras on the DSi aren't very good as it's only 0.3 megapixels, but considering the resolution of the screens themselves, I think it worked for what it needed to do. 8. Nintendo DSi XL. The name speaks for itself, and really the two handhelds could be interchanged on which you'd prefer. The screens are much wider, the speakers can get slightly louder, and the battery life is slightly improved over the regular DSi, which is funny considering there's more screen being displayed here. The stylus is also longer and thicker, making it easier to get a good grip with, but the DSi XL is also a lot larger, making it more clumsy to carry around on the go. So really, it's all about preference for which one you prefer. 7. Nintendo 2DS. So this is one of those systems where you just kind of think, why? The 2DS has always perplexed me because of its decision to remove the ability to close the screens together. They also removed the 3D effects and marketed this primarily towards kids, which seems backwards because the screen is more likely to get scratched up not being able to protect it. Plus it has a lower sound quality and a stagnant battery life. Now, despite all the dislikes I've kind of talked about, it plays games perfectly fine and is still more powerful than any regular DS. Seeing this system in this slate shape though just kind of feels off. 6. New Nintendo 2DS XL. Yeah, the name rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Here is Nintendo's final 3DS system. It's the end of an era for the long-lasting DS and 3DS family. They finished it off with what's basically a new 3DS XL, but without the 3D effects. I'm not really sure why anybody would need to own this. I guess if you don't care for the 3D, but want to get the system for really cheap. But here's the strangest part. This came out in the summer of 2017, while this little console came out a couple months before. But even with all that said, this is still a fantastic system and has all the improvements besides the 3D aspect. It's just weird that this exists at all. It kind of reminds me of the whole Game Boy Micro scenario. 5. Nintendo 3DS. And now we're at the first iteration of the 3DS library. While it looks a little clunky on the outside, it has a lot happening on the inside. The graphics have been improved even more, there's a new home button to help you travel from a game or app back to the main screen, and there's of course the 3D slider, which adds a neat 3D effect to games like Super Mario 3D Land or Mario Kart 7. Along with the D-pad is the circle pad, which makes it more possible to move around in 360 degrees. And did I mention that you can play the entire DS catalog as well? There's loads of new software too, like the new and improved eShop, Street Pass and Spot Pass, Virtual Console for Game Boy games, augmented reality, and even a camera that can take 3D pictures. 4. Nintendo 3DS XL. Not only is this a larger 3DS with bigger screens, but the outer design is a lot cleaner looking too. It's actually the biggest screen of any Nintendo handheld, outside the Switch, but that's a hybrid console anyway. This could be interchanged with the original 3DS, but I've always found the XL to be a bit more comfortable to hold over long periods of time. 3. New Nintendo 3DS. And here begins the absolutely horrible naming of the 3DS systems. The main difference here is the additional buttons, starting with this nubby C-stick and the ZL and ZR triggers on the back. These extra buttons aren't really that intuitive for most games and don't feel the best to use, but it's nice that they're still there regardless. The new 3DS also has a better processor and allowed for games like Xenoblade Chronicles to be ported over. And hey, if you wanted to scan Amiibo into your 3DS, now you don't need that NFC reader because the bottom of the handheld has the reader built right in. The only true downside is the placement of the micro SD card. It's in the rear cover and requires a screw to swap out or remove the cards, but otherwise this thing rocks. 2. New Nintendo 3DS XL. What more do I need to add? It's a new Nintendo 3DS, but it's extra large. The only thing I should mention is that it actually doesn't come with an AC adapter, which is crazy considering the charging port is proprietary. But by this point, if you're buying a handheld with such a ridiculous name, you've already got the AC adapter, so it doesn't really matter that much. 1. Nintendo Switch. Goodbye 3DS and hello Nintendo Switch. While this is technically a hybrid console, you can of course play this in handheld mode, and that is an incredible feat for how powerful it is. The screen on this tablet is in HD and plays AAA games like a charm. And of course it has the Joy-Cons with its endless features and the almighty Pro Controller, but just the simple fact that the Switch can play huge games like Super Mario Odyssey or Doom or Smash Bros. Ultimate is such a huge advantage to every handheld ever created. And we're just getting started. Right now it has a virtual console library of NES games, but in the future we'll probably get SNES, Game Boy, N64, and the list could really go on and on. The Switch has a pretty exciting life ahead of itself, and I'm ready to see what else it's going to throw on the table. And before wrapping up, I just wanted to give a big thanks to Nintendo for letting me use all of his Game Boy and Nintendo systems for the video.
Yeah, no problem.
Nintendo has had a large variety of launch titles for their consoles and handhelds, so I figured we'd piece together the best and the worst. I'll only be talking about Nintendo-developed launch games, so no third parties. We'll be basing this list off the impact they had as well as how fun the games are. And with that said, let's get her ranked. 43. Donkey Kong Jr. Math. Do you enjoy solving math problems in the most long-winded way possible? This game may be up your alley then, because all you do is solve math problems like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, because that is what video games are for. 42. 1-2 Switch. I can barely even qualify this as a game. This overpriced piece of junk comes with 28 different minigames. Most of them you play once and you'll never want to play them again. Some of the minigames do highlight the features of the Joy-Cons well, but this should have come bundled with the Switch. It's one of the most forgettable titles of all time. 41. Stack Up. This was one of the two games that worked with Rob the Robot. All you're really doing is having Rob move some colored blocks from place to place. And you can't even play this game if you don't have Rob. It's a cool concept, but that's about it. 40. Baseball Game Boy. Baseball games were fairly common back in the 80s, and this one is no different. It's a very primitive way to play baseball, and it has Mario in it for some reason. I'll be the first to say it, this feels like a cheap Tiger Electronics game. 39. Baseball NES. Like the Game Boy title, Nintendo used to make really basic sports games like this one. This baseball game isn't that bad for the time, but you might as well just play a modern sports game. 38. Gyromite. This is the second Rob the Robot game, and it's a bit better than Stack Up. Rob moves certain platforms up and down, and you have to navigate your way through the maze. Again, this is a novel idea, but it's not the most practical game out there. 37. Tennis NES. I won't lie, I had more fun with NES Tennis than I thought I would. The controls are somewhat smooth, and it's pretty easy to keep track of the ball. Yeah, that's kind of a big deal for hardware that's so old. Like with baseball though, you're better off playing a modern tennis game. 36. Tennis Game Boy. The best part of this game is the title screen says, music yes. I don't know, something about that cracks me up. This plays almost exactly the same as tennis on the NES. These two games could be interchanged. 35. Ice Climber. This NES classic has a great theme. Simply climb up to the top of the mountain. The music is catchy and I love the aesthetic, but the control is horrible. Trying to move in the air after jumping is very finicky and not fluid at all. Honestly, I'd love to see this game get recreated like Kid Icarus did on the 3DS. 34. Hogan's Alley. This is about as simple as an NES Zapper game can get. There's 3 targets and you have to shoot the bad guys. It's fun, but there's not much meat on it. 33. Wild Gunman. Like Hogan's Alley, you just have to shoot the bad guy and you move on. This one is a bit more interesting as it's presented like a western where you have to fire after he says draw. 32. Duck Hunt. Definitely the most memorable of the Zapper games. You go through rounds and have to shoot birds or discs. The Duck Hunt dog is kind of a dick when you miss your shots, but it adds a lot of charm that the other Zapper titles don't really have. 31. Mario's Tennis. So the first Mario Tennis game was actually on the Virtual Boy. It's not the worst game of all time, but it's pretty barren with features. You can't play tennis with a few different Mario characters, you can do a tournament, and play in singles or doubles. But that's really it. It's pretty disappointing the Virtual Boy didn't launch with a normal Mario game. 30. Pilot Wings. To show off the power of the SNES, Pilot Wings has you either skydiving or landing a plane. It's a neat little game with tasty tunes, but also has no real depth. For what it is, I guess it's fine. 29. Kung Fu. Here we have a very simple beat 'em up. You go around punching or kicking a bunch of enemies. There's not much to it, but there is a satisfying pow to each hit. It's annoying when you miss your aim and kind of get stuck on a few enemies at once, but for one of the first beat 'em ups, it's not too bad. 28. Clue Land. You're gonna need a clue to understand this one. You play as this red blob, going around poles trying to find treasure. You also have to be careful of these blue spiky Yunuras, and this is, I don't know, it's just the weirdest game ever. It's enjoyable, I'll give it that, just really weird. 27. Pinball. The name speaks for itself. You play pinball and try to score the most points before getting a game over. The board has a bunch of ways to nab points, but it also looks kinda bland. But you can't knock it too much since this is NES after all. 26. Teleroboxer. It's one of the better Virtual Boy titles. Teleroboxer is a boxing game that's in the first-person perspective, and it's actually not too bad. It kind of shows off the Virtual Boy's capabilities, but it also shows off its flaws. This game would have benefited so much with more colors. 25. Golf. It's a lot better than you would expect. You simply play games of golf, and have to use a swing meter to measure your power and direction. I like the screen on the left as it better illustrates what's happening, and you can swap clubs on the fly, giving you lots of freedom. 24. Nintendogs and Cats. If you played the original Nintendogs, this game is very similar in nature. You can still pet, feed, bathe, walk, and take your pups to competitions. It's one of those games that you play for a few minutes a day, and you can buy cats as a bonus. The novelty has worn off though, and seems silly to reintroduce this as a launch game. 23. Excitebike. For a motorbike game from the 80s, Excitebike can be quite exciting. You'll drive up and down loads of ramps, and the challenge is keeping your speed by angling your bike correctly in the air. You can even make your own tracks, which is pretty slick for an NES title. 22. Mach Rider. I have to start by saying that the music absolutely slaps. You don't expect it to be so catchy. This is another motorbike game, but you also shoot invaders at the same time. It doesn't even seem like this should work on the NES. It's really quite impressive. 21. Alleyway, or Arkanoid featuring Mario for some reason. This is the perfect game for Game Boy, and while it's not one of the best launch titles, this is still really solid. Alleyway is a game you play for 15 minutes, have a blast, and then set it back down. 20. Steel Diver. One of the biggest oddballs Nintendo ever launched a system with. This is a submarine game entirely controlled by the touchscreen. The presentation and graphics are pretty lackluster, but the gameplay is surprisingly solid. You can fire missiles, take down other submarines, camouflage briefly, and move all at once, and it can be quite a joy to play. 19. Game & Watch Gallery 2. This is another pretty obscure series. The Game & Watch Gallery is a collection of really old Game & Watch games. These simple yet fun mini-games mesh perfectly with the Game Boy Color, and you can play the classic and modern versions of each. 18. Pilot Wings 64. The sequel to Pilot Wings was a decent game for launch. You can hang glide, use a rocket jet, skydive, and much more. Pilot Wings really is more of a flight simulator than a game, but it has this really nice relaxing vibe. 17. Wrecking Crew. Mario has had so many jobs, but everyone seems to forget he was a construction worker. Well, a worker gone wild, I guess. You swing your hammer at rocks and doors to destroy them without getting attacked by other enemies. It's way more enjoyable than you'd think. 16. F-Zero. That's right, this came out before Super Mario Kart did. It's too bad it's been left behind as an IP because the futuristic racing is loads of fun. This game utilized Mode 7 graphics, has slapping music, and still controls pretty well to this day. Also, Nintendo, we're still waiting for that new F-Zero. Any day now, any day would be nice. 15. Nintendo Land. This was Nintendo's unofficial sequel to Wii Sports. Some of the games are loads of fun like Mario Chase, Luigi's Ghost Mansion, and Metroid Blast. But then the other ones just kind of exist, or they can only be played with one person. The overall package is fine for showing off the Wii U gamepad, but it sucks that not every game is single player and multiplayer compatible. 14. New Super Mario Bros. U. So this 2D Mario isn't really a bad game. In fact, I'd say it's one of the best new Super Mario Bros. Titles. The thing is that it came out at a time where this series was going through fatigue, and as a launch game for the Wii U, it didn't make much of an impact. It's still a lot of fun though, and the Luigi U expansion was a nice treat. 13. Super Mario Advance. So instead of a brand new Mario game, the GBA had the Super Mario Advance series. This launch title was a recreation of Super Mario Bros. 2 from the NES. The remake makes the game much easier, and overall a more fun experience, and they even threw in Mario Bros. Just for the heck of it. 12. Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt. I must have played this demo hundreds of times when I first got a DS. While it's only a few minutes long, just seeing a 3D Metroid on this tiny handheld was a landmark achievement. The controls aren't perfect, but they function well for what it is. First Hunt is a short and sweet package. 11. Super Mario 64 DS. While I'm not a fan of the controls in Mario 64 DS, they did as much as they could with the D-pad, and this port still retains the entirety of the N64 classic, plus several more stars and worlds to explore. And you can play as 4 different characters, all with different attributes. For a remake, it really pushes the envelope. 10. Wii Sports. While technically a demo, if you were alive in the 2000s, then your family probably owned a Wii and Wii Sports. There's 5 different sports you can play either in single or multiplayer, and it shows off the capabilities of the Wiimote really well. While the motion controls are really basic, this game is still a blast to play. 9. Luigi's Mansion. Yeah, Mario Sunshine wasn't the launch game, but instead we get this gem. Luigi's Mansion has you playing as Luigi, and Professor Egad forces him to suck up ghosts to save his brother Mario. This is one of the first games to give charm and character to the Mario franchise, and the idea of sucking up ghosts and treasure is a pretty awesome concept. 8. Super Mario Land. Here we have a Mario game where Bowser isn't the bad guy, and you don't save Peach, and there's no Fire Flower, but it's still a wonderful time. Super Mario Land is very short, but the levels are so creative, the music is infectious, and you get to fly in a spaceship. 7. The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. Without a doubt, one of the biggest launch games of all time. Twilight Princess was the return to a darker and grittier Zelda game, and people bought a Wii just to play this, and it still holds up pretty well. I wouldn't say it's the best Zelda ever, but it has a unique identity as the most edgy one in the franchise. 6. Super Mario World. There's not much better you can do with a launch game than have it be a successor to Super Mario Bros. 3. Mario World looks better, has more worlds, introduces Yoshi, there's new power-ups, and an even more expansive world map. That is how you launch a console. 5. Super Mario Bros. While the original Super Mario Bros. Hasn't aged the best, it is one of the most important games of all time. It single-handedly saved the video game industry and introduced us to one of the most recognizable characters of all time. Yes, there was the Donkey Kong arcade machine, but Super Mario Bros. Is when Mario really shined. 4. Tetris. One more can be said about Tetris. This game is so good that people, including myself, continue to buy it over and over on multiple different consoles. Tetris 99 does have a lot of bells and whistles, but the same addicting gameplay is still featured on the Game Boy. 3. Tetris DX. There's not much I can really add, except that it's Tetris in color. That's really the only big difference, and it also doesn't have the classic Tetris music for some reason. For that alone, the Game Boy one may be considered better, but that's up to interpretation. The gameplay is still as addicting as it can be. 2. Super Mario 64. I know, I have Mario 64 bias, but can you blame me? Mario 64 revolutionized 3D gaming to what it is today, and it's still a pretty fun game after all these years. It helped create dozens of new 3D platformers and pioneered the way to a more modern gaming life. 1. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Nintendo really struggled in the Wii U era, but the Switch and Breath of the Wild has put them back on the forefront. This game is a revolution to the NES Zelda, since it's completely open world and explodes with places to visit and discover. It's so easy to get lost in this game for dozens or even hundreds of hours. Breath of the Wild is truly a magical experience. We all know and love Nintendo's classic controllers, but what about those really weird third-party ones? I've gone ahead and picked out 25 of the strangest controllers you can use on Nintendo systems. This list is based off how useful the controller is and how many games it can be used with. So with that, let's get her ranked. 25. U-Force. Connect fans, get your virtual pitchforks out because I am not a fan of this controller. As I'm sure you know, you're supposed to play the game with your hand movements, which is read with infrared sensors. As cool as that might sound, it doesn't actually work. Like, at all. You're supposed to be able to control the D-pad, A, and the B buttons with your hands, while Start and Select have designated buttons on the bottom. There's also turbo buttons and game switches to change the controls, but even with the correct switches, it's incredibly unresponsive. Maybe the U-Force worked better back in the day, but you have zero sense of control with this thing. It also comes with a flight stick and a power bar for some games, but why even bother? 24. N64 Logitech controller. This looks like your typical N64 controller, but it was used exclusively for hotels. There's also some new buttons on here like order, menu, reset, select, and even some phone keys. These were used for services at the hotel and even controlling the TV to change channels. While this is a really unique piece of history, there's one problem with it. It's not usable anymore. The end of this has an RJ11 phone connector, which can't be used with a normal N64 unless you heavily modded the controller. There's actually a great video about this controller which I highly recommend you check out from Nintendo after watching this. 23. SNES NTT datapad. You want to talk about an obscure piece of gaming history? You're looking at it now. The NTT datapad was used for one Japanese game called Drop Hat, and the game allowed you to gamble online for horse racing. This game only worked in Japan, and the service has ended now, which makes this controller a dud. That's right, you can't even use this for normal games. I tried it on my SNES and, well, nothing happened. And it's too bad that it doesn't work because I actually really like the bigger size and the buttons. The grip is really comfortable and the buttons have a solid click to them. So again, it's too bad you can't use it normally. 22. Laser scope. In case you didn't feel like using the zapper in Duck Hunt, the laser scope lets you yell "fire" into a microphone instead. You'll aim your target by using this scope, and as a bonus, you can plug the audio cable directly into the NES. And if you really wanted, these can also be used as actual headphones too. I really would love to meet the one guy that did this unironically. The huge problem here is most games don't work with the laser scope, and you'd need the proper TV to be able to use this at all. It's an interesting but mostly useless novelty. 21. N64 Power Glove. One look at this thing and carpal tunnel is knocking at your door. We'll get to the complexity of the NES Power Glove in a bit, but I'll give this one some props as there's not really any setup to use this. You just plug it in and strap your arms up. The buttons are all laid out across your fingers and the D-pad is positioned near your thumb. You may have noticed one button missing, the joystick. That is controlled by bending your wrist. The original idea is this is supposed to make FPS games easier to aim with. Well, supposed to in quotations. I had no idea what direction I was supposed to bend my wrist in, and hitting the buttons is extremely uncomfortable. When I try to push B as an example, I would always hit R by accident just because they're so close together. Now I did try this with GoldenEye, and well, maybe my glove is just broken or something, but it just didn't want to work. Like, I would move around and sometimes it would move with me and sometimes it didn't. 20. NES Power Glove. If there's one thing I can say, it looks a lot cooler than the N64 glove. Does it function any better though? Well, no and kind of yes. So this glove is different from the N64 one because its main purpose is to use only your fingers and thumbs to play. Right away, that sounds like a bad idea, and that's because it is. Before even playing, you have to set up these sensors, and there's no easy way to do that, especially if you have a big TV. I was forced to use an older TV to set this up, and I needed to use a load of duct tape just to keep the sensors up. Next, you have to put in a specific code for each game because they all work a little differently. And after all of that, shockingly, the glove actually kind of works. By flicking your fingers or thumbs, it triggers different inputs. But that doesn't matter, because none of the games are intuitive with this playstyle. So now you might think, well, you could just use the controller on the glove, right? Well, my answer to that? Not really, because the motions of the glove are always activated, so random inputs are gonna get projected if you move the glove too much when pushing the buttons. This whole thing is just a big, beautiful mess that somehow technically works and just doesn't. 19. Rollin' Rocker. This is basically a DDR pad with one giant button. The idea behind this one is the rocker becomes the D-pad on your controller. By shifting your weight around, you'll be able to move around on screen. And believe it or not, this actually works. That isn't saying much though, considering how much more effort it takes to move compared to using your thumb. And what's funny is you need the NES controller plugged in to use the other buttons. So there's literally no reason to use this thing, unless you're with some friends and want to goof off and play games with this hunk of plastic. 18. Ultra Racer 64. The most impressive thing about this is they managed to cram all the N64 buttons into what's basically a glorified nunchuck. The main reason to own this is to improve racing games with this little wheel, and I do gotta say, it's surprisingly accurate and moves very fluidly. This felt on the outside helps a lot with gripping too. There's also a trigger on the back in which you push down for A and push up for B. All of this is fine, but there's not much of a way to move up and down, so you're really stuck with just racing games with this controller. And the D-pad buttons are way too tiny and barely usable. I mean, just look at this thing. It's just a big cluster of buttons. It's a Wii Remote gone wrong. The Ultra Racer 64 is a neat idea and concept, but it's kind of unnecessary and doesn't really need to exist. 17. Miracle Piano. It certainly is a miracle that a full-fledged piano is compatible with the NES. This was a rather robust tool for learning how to play piano back in the day. Plus, the one game it works with has actual mini-games in it to make the learning more fun. The keys feel like your typical piano keys, and there's even options to change the volume and sounds. With all that said, it's really only good for one game, and the piano is pretty darn spendy. It originally retailed at $500. In 2019 with inflation, it would cost almost $1,000. 16. DDR Action Pad. It still trips me out that this was created for a Mario game. There's a lot of DDR pads out there, and this is one of the better ones. The material feels nice, it's fairly light and folds well, and the overall design looks pretty solid. The pad buttons are responsive too, as I had no issues with the controls or anything of that nature. While you can technically play other GameCube games with this, it doesn't have all the same inputs, so it's gonna be a little wonky or just straight up unplayable. It's really just for DDR Mario Mix, so that does limit its use, but it's perfect if you're craving that kind of game. 15. Quick Shot Trackball. Here's an NES controller that's supposed to be used for trackball games like Marble Madness. So you'd expect this giant ball to move in 360 degrees, but it's just a joypad. You can push it around in 8 directions, and that's it. The A and B buttons are kind of cool, they're fairly large and fun to click, but this trackball is just horrible. There's suction cups on the bottom to try to prevent the controller from moving, but I found they suction pretty poorly. The Quick Shot Trackball does work with every game, but there's so many better options out there. 14. Zoomer. Okay, so here we have a flight stick for the NES. The entire stick is the D-pad, and you can push and pull it to move up and down. The top of the stick has the A and B buttons, and you can also increase or decrease their sensitivity. And to my surprise, moving around with this was kind of comfortable and accurate, and the grips feel pretty good as well. Here's my question though, how many flight simulator games are there on the NES? Besides Top Gun, nothing else really comes to mind. The main issue is that this controller moves when you're trying to turn, which can be disorienting. There is suction cups to try to remedy that, but they just aren't strong enough. This seems like another silly controller that didn't need to be made, but at least it's something fun to bring out for parties. 13. Ultimate Super Stick. Was this compressed NES Advantage truly ultimate? Well, kind of. I do like the way this looks. It kind of reminds me of a spaceship in a way. At first, I was confused why there was A and B buttons on both sides until I realized that they're accommodating for right and left hand players, which is pretty rare to see. The suction cups to keep this nailed down doesn't really work though. Although like I've been saying, it's probably just the age of this controller. My only true gripe with this is unfortunately the most important part, the joystick. It's way stiffer than it needs to be. It doesn't feel that great to move around with. I think people love the NES Advantage because the joystick is really fluid, and this is the complete opposite. 12. Guitar Hero Wii Controller. This is by far the most nostalgic third-party controller for me. Over a decade ago, music games were the big craze, and Guitar Hero 3 came to the Wii with this fancy guitar. It has 5 fret buttons, a strum bar, a whammy stick, as well as a joystick and a couple of buttons. There's multiple versions of this guitar, and people tend to prefer the Guitar Hero 3 and Guitar Hero 5 variants. These are by far some of the most durable controllers out there. I've rarely had issues with them besides the whammy bar breaking over several years of use. The only true issue is that it's intent for Guitar Hero and Rock Band games only, and they don't really work for anything else. Despite its limited game selection, you could easily spend hundreds upon hundreds of hours playing and mastering all the songs out there. 11. GameCube Joy-Cons. One glance at these will catch anybody's attention. They may look like a Smash Bros. Player's dream controller, but unfortunately there's a barrage of issues. Firstly, the joysticks are the same ones as the regular Joy-Cons, and looking closer, closer, you'll see that the analog gates are rotated incorrectly. But guess what? That doesn't even matter because the joysticks don't even reach the gates, which means they incorrectly added the gates and they're just for show. Next, we'll talk about the buttons. The clickiness feeling is fine, but the buttons themselves aren't tall enough. And for some reason, the rumble is way more powerful than it needs to be. Just listen to this. What the hell? Like, why is it so strong? Now, people love the pressure-sensitive shoulder buttons on the GameCube controller, but this doesn't have that at all. It's just basic buttons. I know I've criticized this controller a lot, so I will say that the D-pad is pretty decent, although not 100% responsive. And I do really like the ergonomics on the sides. They're definitely more comfortable to hold than the regular Joy-Cons. The addition of a charge port on the controllers is nice too, although they were put on the sides, which is a little weird, and they don't have a door to protect dust from getting in. And unlike most third-party controllers, it does have an NFC reader and motion controls. These GameCube Joy-Cons are an awesome idea, I just think they need to be tweaked and revised a bit. 10. Switch 8-bit Do Lite. If you ever missed the Virtual Boy's double D-pads, then this might be for you. This has to be the weirdest new controller out there. The battery life is around 18 hours, which isn't too bad, but it's also missing motion controls, rumble, and the NFC reader, so it's pretty bare bones on features. On the flip side, this is third party, so it works with a Switch as well as other devices that utilize Bluetooth. And it's pretty cheap, sitting at 25 bucks. This is meant primarily for 2D games only, and after trying things like Tetris 99, Celeste, and a few NES titles, the D-pads and buttons hold up really well. The controller is a bit on the small side, but my hands didn't really cramp up when playing. I will say though, the tiny ZL and ZR buttons are in a horrible spot and might cause cramping from long periods of play. Another downside is the L3 and R3 buttons. You push down on the D-pads to activate them, but it doesn't really work well and it's super clunky feeling too. 9. Super Pad Plus 64. This is by far the most awkward controller I've ever seen. The right side feels fine to hold, but the left is too big. Like, why is the scaling so different? The joystick is better than the original, but that isn't much competition to beat, and it feels a bit slippery. The analog gates are rotated wrong as well, although that didn't really impact gameplay at all. The buttons feel really nice though, and the D-pad is pretty solid too. There's also a slow and auto button if you ever wanted to use those. I am so conflicted on the Super Pad Plus 64 because it functions better than the original N64 one, but it also goes out of its way to be shaped so bizarrely for no good reason. 8. N64 Arcade Shark. Every console gets some sort of arcade controller. Here's the N64's. Now, the one that I have is honestly in really bad shape. The D-pad is almost torn out of place, and some of the buttons have stickers that say, "Winning is everything." It's not, but okay. Even though my controller has been heavily used, it still works pretty well. The buttons have a satisfying click to them, the joystick movement is very fluid, and there's also a slow and auto button. You can even hook up a rumble pack on the top, which is super weird, but pretty neat. The best feature of the Arcade Shark is that you can interchange the joystick by simply unscrewing it. If you're into fighting games and can find a well-kept-up Arcade Shark, this might actually be worth picking up. 7. RE4 Chainsaw Controller. You know you've got a good game when an entire controller is created for it. I technically have the PS2 one and not the GameCube one, but they're very similar outside of the plastic coloring and the button placement. While this looks like a mess, it's actually somewhat comfortable to play games with. The main face buttons are right on the front with the joysticks, and R1 and L1 are attached to both of the handles. The only bad button placement is R2 and L2 just because they're so far away from everything else. Here's something really cool about this controller though. It has 2 pause buttons. There's this one that's a normal button, and this is the second one. That's right, the pulley pauses the game with sound effects and lights. That is just awesome. 6. Turbo Touch 360. I gotta say, a touch-based D-pad for the NES sounded like a horrible concoction, but then I tried it out and holy crap, it's actually pretty darn amazing. Moving around is just as easy and simple as with a normal D-pad. Heck, I'd almost consider this better to use when trying to roll your thumb around. Now, the easiest comparison to this type of D-pad is using a touchscreen on a phone. Without haptic feedback, it's not gonna feel right or be accurate, but there kind of is feedback because of the plastic barrier on the outside, which helps set boundaries for your thumb. The only issue I found is that the buttons are a little sticky, but that's likely just from aging. 5. GameCube Mad Catz controller. This is by far the most popular third-party controller for the GameCube. It seems like everybody had one, but nobody ever wanted to use it. It's roughly the same size as the regular controller, but now there's these side grips. They seem a little unnecessary. I'm not getting a firmer grip or anything. The best way to sum up the Mad Catz is that it's the same thing, but with slightly cheaper build quality. The original is like eating Chick-fil-A, and the Mad Catz is McDonald's. The joystick feels kinda slippery, the start button's a bit mushy, and the face buttons don't have the most solid feeling clicks. I mean, the Mad Catz functions perfectly fine as an alternative. It's not really bad, but you might as well just use a regular controller. 4. GameCube ASCII keyboard controller. This isn't just a controller. You could wield this as a sword in battle if you wanted. So obviously, this hilariously large controller has a full keyboard built in. It has all the English keys, but also Japanese hiragana and Latin characters. While I don't have a way to test the functionality of the keyboard, I can already say that it's a little on the small side. My hands felt squished when typing. I mean, look how tiny the spacebar is. The buttons, though, feel pretty much the same as the normal controller, although I notice the joystick is a bit looser feeling. That doesn't hinder me playing though. Now this was made for one game, Phantasy Star Online, and unfortunately that's about it. So even though you can't really use the keyboard, I honestly really enjoyed using this as a standard controller. It's much lighter than you'd expect it to be, and it grips really well in your hands. 3. Bebon Cool Switch Pro controller. I know this looks like some weird PlayStation knockoff, but this is a surprisingly solid alternative to the regular Pro controller. My favorite thing about it is the grips. They feel downright mesmerizing. The build quality is really impressive too. I'm not sure how long the durability will last, but as of now, it works perfectly. The buttons feel great, including the shoulder ones, and it even has gyro controls and rumble added in. The PlayStation-inspired D-pad is surprisingly responsive. I was able to play platformers and Tetris at ease. In fact, I would say this is more accurate than the Pro controller's D-pad. I'm not joking. I also tried this with Splatoon, and believe it or not, I forgot I was using a third-party controller when playing. That's how much I enjoyed this. The only small downside is there's no capture button. And what's strange about that is this minus button seems like it would be used for capturing, but it just doesn't function half the time. And the charging port isn't USB-C either, but that's not that big a deal. 2. N64 HoriPad Mini. It's pretty rare that a third-party controller so drastically improves over the original, but the HoriPad Mini is one of those cases. The biggest upgrade is of course the joystick. It looks and feels exactly like the one from the GameCube. It's much better than that dinky nub from before. The Z button has also been improved as it's put on the left and right side next to the shoulder buttons. The start button feels better too. Heck, even the rumble pack more snugly fits in than the originals does, which is kinda crazy. The only negative thing here is the high price, and the D-pad is a touch too close to the A and B buttons. If you're playing a game that relies heavily on the D-pad, your thumbs might get in the way of each other. And 1. Colander Wii U Pro controller. While it's not the most interesting looking controller from this video, it's by far the most functional. The design is identical to the regular Wii U Pro controller outside of a few differences. When rotating the joysticks, they feel a smidge rougher and not as smooth. The buttons also feel a touch more mushy, but honestly, you don't even notice these differences when playing. Everything functions flawlessly. I actually prefer the sync button on the Colander because it pops out a little bit more, making it a bit easier to press, but it still won't get pushed accidentally. If you aren't interested in owning authentic controllers, I'd highly recommend getting this over Nintendo's because it's a little bit cheaper. The Wii sure had video games. In fact, over 1,500 of them. Today, we'll be going through the top 20 best sellers and figuring out which are the best and which are the worst. So grab your Wii remote, get those wrist straps removed, and let's get her ranked. 20. Just Dance 2. Welp, I've reached peak gaming. I'm finally playing a Just Dance game on the Wii, and it's about what I expected. You'll pick from a dozen songs and basically just dance to them. You're given some cues to tell you what kind of dance to do, but you can do pretty much whatever you want. It doesn't matter that much. I did try to actually dance along like you're supposed to, and managed to miss most of the movements, but still get a good score. This is a party game through and through. That's all it was made for. There's no campaign mode or anything like that. Honestly, there's next to no substance. You could buy extra songs when the Wii had the internet, and that's a nice feature to have. And the menu UI is also pretty sick. But generally speaking, there is not much to Just Dance 2, especially if you don't like this kind of poppy music. 19. Just Dance 3. Breaking news! Just Dance 3 had a downloadable Mario song with Mario jamming out. I know, truly a mind-blowing fun fact. This really comes down to preference of songs, because that's what it's all about with the Just Dance games. And you can't tell me Just Dance 2 is better than 3 when 3 has Take On Me, Gonna Make You Sweat, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, Party Rock Anthem, Are You Gonna Go My Way, and I Was Made for Loving You. I actually like way more of these songs than I thought I would. The gameplay is exactly the same, however. It's too bad that they didn't try to integrate more dance moves or just, I don't know, anything else with substance. 18. Wii Fit. What a bizarre game for Nintendo to produce, and also have it be one of their most successful Wii games. With Wii Fit Trainer, you'll go through a variety of exercises and try to improve your overall fitness. I was a teenager when this game came out, and played it with my family pretty frequently at the time. It was a really fun bonding experience, but did it help us lose any weight? No, of course not, but at least it had good intentions. The balance games are the highlight since they're more like actual games. I always loved soccer heading, ski jump, and ski slalom. And while the other exercises were great, they got old really quickly, especially the yoga and strength stuff. Some of these are actually really good for you, but it sure was annoying doing one of them and having to wait a full minute to move on to the next one. The aerobic stuff like hula hoop and advanced step were a lot of fun at first, but again, they got boring. And this is supposed to be a game where you go back to it daily, not to mention that almost all these exercises can be cheesed with weights on your balance board or just waggling the remote around, but that's besides the point. This is a product of its time, and it's interesting Nintendo is still embracing the idea with things like Ring Fit Adventure. 17. Wii Fit Plus. If you liked Wii Fit, it's the exact same game with all the same exercises, but also adds plenty more. There's a few yoga and strength exercises, but the majority of the new content comes from Training Plus. Just about all of these are a blast to play, and while they really don't give you much of a workout, they are a lot more fun to play. Obstacle Course was always awesome since it actually made you feel a bit like Mario. The skateboarding and Segway games were also a great time, and same with island cycling since you could explore such a massive amount of Woohoo Island. And if you already had a bunch of progress made from the first game, you could transfer it to the Plus version pretty easily, which was a really nice quality of life feature. 16. Link's Crossbow Training. The Wii really was the king of selling demos, as the crossbow training barely cracked the top 20 in sales. This was one of the many Wii accessories that don't enhance the remote and nunchuck, but at least it feels kind of cool. I don't mind the Wii Zapper. It's got a nice grip on the hands and works well enough with the crossbow training. As for the game, it's pretty much just an on-rail shooter where you'll hit targets, enemies, and sometimes run around on a small map to shoot things. The accuracy is pretty spot on, and has a really nice feel to it. Each stage has plenty of background objects to hit to score extra points, which makes the overall game more immersive. There's also a multiplayer mode in practice, but that's really about it. It'll only take you an hour or two to play through the game, and while it's short, it's a good time. 15. Wii Play. Ah yes, the tech demo that sold stupidly well because it came with a Wii remote. This is a lot like Wii Sports in nature, even sharing the same menu UI, but with a bigger variety of games. You'll pop some balloons, play air hockey, go fishing, ride cows, and of course there's Wii Tanks. This is the highlight of the game with over 100 different missions to go through. While about half of these games are great, the other half are mostly one and done deals. Pose me and find me get repetitive really quickly, and games like billiards and fishing are just alright. Wii Play is worth experiencing, especially if you're playing with a friend since there's multiplayer, but it's not quite as memorable as Wii Sports. 14. Wii Party. Why did nobody tell me how good this game is? It was the only Wii series title I hadn't tried until now, and it's honestly really solid. It's another minigame collection, but with a lot more to do. The main event is Board Game Island, where you'll take turns rolling a dice trying to reach the top of the island while playing minigames in between. It's a lot like Mario Party 8, but also kind of feels like Mario Party 9. The boards are very linear, but you also don't all roll at the same time, which is obviously nice, and you're rewarded extra dice blocks for playing well in a minigame. It's actually pretty fun, and I wish that they just made more boards like this one instead of creating other game modes. Globetrot, Swap Meet, Spin-Off, and Bingo are fine, but they don't really have the same depth. The minigames are what really shine. They all play really well. 13. Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, the crossover of the century. And of course, it had to be a frickin' minigame collection instead of something really cool. That's not to say this game is bad or anything, but I mean, this does kind of, and I mean completely scream missed opportunity to take two massive IPs and pit them together like this. This was 2008. I have got to get over this. Anyway, this minigame compilation is about what you'd expect from the title. Mario, Sonic, and their pals all compete in Olympic events to score for the gold. There are some exceptionally fun events like trampoline, archery, table tennis, and all the dream events. The dream events are the standouts as they remix the sport and make something more gamified, to put it lightly. With that said, there are some absolute stinkers in here. Aquatics 4x100 freestyle is obnoxious because of how long it is, and same with athletics 400-meter hurdles. And there's not much of a single-player mode either. You've got circuits which combine some games together, but that's about it. 12. Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Winter Games. Wow, it's the same game but with Winter Games thrown in and many improvements. You've got a better character roster and many more dream events. They were the highlight of the first game, so seeing them better represented here was an excellent idea. The main events have much less waggling than the first game, which is a huge plus as they got really excessive and tiring. The festival mode does a much better job with the single player experience, and there's tons of unlockables to get as well. Even with all the fixes this game offers, I don't really see myself coming back to this game for any reason. It's like that with all the Mario and Sonic games, but at least this one improved itself quite a bit. 11. Wii Sports. Yes, this was bundled with most Wiis, which explains its insane sales number, but this isn't even a game at this point. It's not even a demo. It's a goddamn cultural phenomenon. Or at least it was for a few years. Even so, it's beloved to this very day and is still pretty fun to play. You got 5 sports to pick from, and you pretty much just waggle the remote around to hit tennis balls, swing your bat, bowl, golf, or box Matt. Yes, Matt has become somewhat of a legend and meme over the years as well. For a tech demo, there's honestly quite a bit to do. On top of the 5 sports, which you can level up from, there's plenty of training modes to try as well. The best, of course, being the bowling, where you try to hit 91 pins at once. I can't tell you how many times I've played through this one mode alone. 10. Wii Sports Resort. How do you improve Wii Sports? Include the favorites from before and add a ton more games with Wii Motion Plus controls. This is gonna age me, but I actually watched this game be revealed at E3 over a decade ago, and it was expanding the original game's magic in a matter of seconds. Some of the best new sports included swordplay, cycling, and air sports. It's pretty crazy how much the Wii Motion Plus actually improved the motion, adding tuning fork gyroscope. The real question, however, is if Wii Sports is a game or just an expanded demo. It's honestly really hard to tell since the lines are so blurred. It definitely lies somewhere in the middle. 9. LEGO Star Wars, The Complete Saga. People love the LEGO. People love the Star Wars, so it only makes sense to combine them together. The Complete Saga is essentially a compilation of LEGO Star Wars 1 and 2, plus a little extra on top of that, so you'll get to play through all 6 episodes in LEGO form. With over 100 characters to pick from, there's more than enough fan service to go around. The gameplay is fun enough since you'll run around, fight enemies, and solve small puzzles, although it is a bit on the simple side, which I guess is to be expected since this is a LEGO-themed game. 8. Mario Party 8. I'm just gonna say it. This and Mario Party DS were the last good Mario Parties. Super Mario Party isn't that bad, but this one still slaps and one that I actually want to play again and again. The main reason Mario Party 8 is so great really comes down to one board. And you know what it is. Koopa's Tycoon Town. A board where you collect stars by purchasing hotels. The highest bidding price owns the stars and hotels, which creates strategy not seen in most Mario Party games. The other boards are also pretty fun, and same with the minigames. It's one of the rare times where motion controls actually enhance the minigames you're playing since they're fairly basic motions. Also, you can play as a hammer bro, I mean, hello! The candies do enough to spruce up the board gameplay, and there's plenty of extra modes to try out as well. 7. New Super Mario Bros. Wii. Never has a game encapsulated a system so perfectly. This is the perfect pick-up-and-play platformer. It's Mario, and it can be played with 4 players, which was a new and exciting feature at the time. The main highlights for this one come down to the new power-ups, notably the penguin suit and propeller mushroom. The propeller lets you fly through the air, and the penguin throws ice balls and slides on the ground. That does kind of make the ice flower moot since that only lets you throw ice balls, but that's also a new power-up. The environments in each level aren't anything exciting, but the gameplay is incredibly solid as you'd expect. Although it definitely would have been nice if they spruced up the graphics or at least changed up the locations a little bit. There is at least a good amount of new enemies, the return of Yoshi, a special coin world, and an unlockable World 9 with extra tough levels. 6. Donkey Kong Country Returns. Before this title, the last DKC game we got was Donkey Kong 64 back in 1999. There were a lot of spin-off games to come out, but people were craving that classic 2D platformer. And we got something special from Retro Studios. DKC Returns is basically what you'd expect from a DKC game, where you'll run through levels with 2 characters with different attributes and sometimes using vehicles or animals to travel. Diddy Kong is mostly used as a way to hover in mid-air or for rolling through enemies. I've mostly played this as a co-op game, and it's an absolute barrel blast. For the Wii, the graphics are extremely impressive and still look great to this day. The levels work really well with co-op. In fact, the level design is constantly changing and is a blast the whole way through. There's really only one drawback, that being the force motion controls for half of the movement. Yes, half of the movement. It'd be one thing if it was just for occasionally blowing something for a puzzle, but you have to shake your controller for ground pounding, rolling, and charging with Rambi. It definitely gets a bit annoying after a while, but it's not a game breaker or anything. 5. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, the big Zelda adventure that everyone was craving, but nowadays seems to be kind of forgotten about. Once you get past Twilight Princess's slow beginning, it really picks up from there with things like transforming into a wolf with new abilities and meeting Midna, who's an iconic Zelda character at this point. The gameplay feels a lot like Ocarina of Time at first, which definitely isn't a bad thing since that's still an incredible game to this day. The graphics, while great at the time, don't really hold up too well, especially the original Wii version. I'd rather look at Wind Waker than Twilight Princess aesthetically, but it's not necessarily bad. And the motion controls do the job too. You don't have to swing your entire arm to slash, which is nice considering this is a pretty long and meaty game. 4. Mario Kart Wii. I really didn't think Nintendo was gonna have another Mario Kart sell as well as the Wii one did, but you know, Switch, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, sales are meant to be broken. Now this Mario Kart in particular is interesting because there seems to be 2 kinds of general opinions about it. The first group finds this game to be really boring and hasn't aged well, and the second group discovered God's second coming, CTGP. I'm not gonna be talking about the incredible modding scene, but it's there for a reason. Mario Kart Wii on its own is still a really fun Mario Kart. The character selection is one of the best, and that's mostly because it has Funky Kong. That's just an objective fact you can't tell me isn't cool because he is very, very cool. This was the first game to introduce karts and bikes, which changed up the game pretty drastically. Both drive so differently from one another, making for really varied racing experiences. Some of the new tracks are still some of the best the series has seen, with classics like Maple Treeway, Coconut Mall, Koopa Cape, Wario's Gold Mine, Grumble Volcano, and so on. This is also the Mario Kart with the most battle mode stages, featuring 10 total. While I don't like that you're forced to use a timer and you respawn after losing your balloons, there's still great stages. The new items are admittedly not that great, but the selection overall works well. The online at the time was also pretty smooth, and there were even tournaments you could participate in. It's still a great game to go back to, especially if you can dive deep into the in-depth controls the game has. 3. Super Mario Galaxy. You know you gotta hit when fans of the Galaxy series are still requesting a Mario Galaxy 3. I don't realistically see that ever happening, but I totally understand why there's such a high demand for that after so many years. Mario Galaxy takes the idea of a platformer and flips it on its head. Literally. Many levels have you walking on the walls and ceilings, and it's shockingly smooth to control. There are so many ways the controls could have gone wrong, but they managed to make it work somehow. And not only that, but the levels are incredible. It's a more linear experience than 64 or Sunshine, but that allows for more focus on interesting level design. And they sure delivered with that, with galaxies like Toy Time, Good Egg, Buoy Base, Melty Molten, and etc. The Comet Observatory is a fun hub world, as it's not too big, but also not so massive that it takes 15 minutes to get anywhere. I generally prefer the more straightforward level selection from Galaxy 2, but the observatory is really nice to have as well. The star bit and pull star mechanics are great, and the new power-ups are fun too, but nothing overly mind-blowing. The Bee Mushroom is really the only notable power-up that I like using. I've also got to mention that a lot of people prefer Galaxy 1 over 2 for better music, as well as for the more personalized story. And I do love Rosalina's storybook explaining the lore behind Rosalina in outer space to becoming a mother for the Lumas. That definitely adds a much-needed personal touch. 2. Super Mario Galaxy 2. I can't begin to tell you how many people ask if I prefer Mario Galaxy 1 or 2, and this is one of my few opinions that have remained consistent over the years. I've always preferred Galaxy 2 over 1 due to a number of factors. Like the first game, the galaxies are extremely creative and imaginative. In fact, I'd argue they're even more interesting in this title. A big reason for that is because of Yoshi. He has a few different fruits he can consume to let him run really fast, blow up like a balloon, or radiate some sort of light to see invisible parts parts of a room. Something else I feel like a lot of people don't bring up is the absurd amount of bosses this game has. Of course, there's Bowser and Bowser Jr., but you've got some really diverse ones like Squizzard, Dig-a-Leg, Gobblegut, and so on and so forth. Plus, at the end of the game, you get to refight most of the Galaxy 1 bosses on top of that. The Galaxy 1 power-ups also return, with some awesome new ones like the Cloud Flower and Rock Mushroom. Every part of this game is filled to the brim with new ideas. It's still impressive even to this day, and when the game is done, you have 120 green stars to find, which I personally find to be way more interesting than just replaying the game again as Luigi, although I do agree that it's annoying that you can't get all 3 green stars without getting kicked out of the level every time. This was also the first 3D Mario to introduce impossible levels at the very end, with the perfect run being absolutely brutal. And Mario games to this day are still doing this, which is a great reward after getting accustomed to the game. 1. Super Smash Bros. Brawl. I get it. Some people don't like this game because it's slow, and the Wi-Fi was horrible, and the graphics may have not aged super well, but in comparison to the best-selling games on this list, there's really no competition. While the Galaxy games are great fun, you play through them once and that's it. With Brawl, there's a near endless amount of replayability. You got 35 characters to play as, or 39 if you count all the Pokemon with Pokemon Trainer, as well as Zelda/Sheik and Samus/Zero Suit Samus. This was the first Smash to introduce third parties like Snake and Sonic, which completely changed the definition of who can make it into Smash Bros. I mean, getting Snake and Sonic back in the day is the same equivalent as Steve from Minecraft getting into Smash Bros. Ultimate. But then there's the game modes. Where can I possibly begin here? How about Subspace Emissary, a 10 to 15 hour campaign with almost an hour of cutscenes featuring most of the characters teaming up against Taboo. This is a side mode, by the way, a side mode. I don't think I can emphasize that enough. This is just bonus. And then you've got Classic Mode, All-Star, Boss Rush, an entire stage builder which you used to be able to share your stages online with friends, masterpieces, hundreds of trophies, stickers, and CDs to collect. And there are a ton of new stages, and even a nice selection of old ones from Melee. This game is really underappreciated as a single-player experience, and I didn't even bring up the massive achievement wall, coin launcher, hundreds of songs, multiple controller methods with customized button layouts. I could seriously go on and on and on. Not even Ultimate can compete with Brawl's single-player experience.